given kind of the time constraints and so many good speakers, I think we should probably just jump right into it. And I'm sure more will join as we go. So to start and kind of give context for this was supposed to be an HFSA session last year. Obviously, we weren't able to join in person, unfortunately. So we wanted to bring it to an online forum and hopefully use it as a resource for the future, recorded on the HFSA website and such. And really the impetus for it, when I was talking to Shashank last year was, what were my struggles coming into an early career role. And one of them that I identified was really becoming a PI, and specifically for me, industry trials. And you'll hear kind of a broad perspective here of different types of, investigator roles. And really what lessons could I have taught my former self 2 years ago and stopped a lot of pain. So hopefully we'll explore that across a variety of domains and get some good insight. So I'm just going to have all the speakers introduce themselves. So I'm Spencer Carter. I'm from the University of Utah, one of the early career faculty here and part of the early career group under Shashank's leadership. Shashank, maybe you next.
Yes, I'm Spencer's sidekick here. I'm Shashank Sinha. I'm an advanced heart failure transplant cardiologist at Inova. I have the pleasure and privilege of working with one of our distinguished speakers and panelists here, Palak, Shah, who taught me quite a bit about how to be a PI. So looking forward to his insights and others. And thanks all of you for joining us this evening.
Nosheen.
Thanks, Spencer and Shashank. And hi, everyone. My name is Nosheen Reza. I'm an advanced heart failure transplant cardiologist and a genetic cardiologist at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm in my early career. This is my 5th year on faculty.
Awesome. Priya?
Hi, folks. Thanks very much, Spencer and Shashank. I'm Priya Umapathi. I'm one of the advanced heart failure and transplant cardiologists at Johns Hopkins. I run a basic science and translational lab, and I'm the head of the cardiometabolic clinic at Johns Hopkins, and I'm also on my 5th year of faculty. Nosheen and I spent much of time at a cardiology board prep some years ago and are bonded for life. Happy to be here with you guys.
Orly.
Hi, I'm Orly Vardeny, and I am a pharmacist by training. I have been at the Minneapolis VA and the University of Minnesota for the past 7 years. And before then, I was at the University of Wisconsin, which was my first job out of training. So I'm excited to join this group. And
I think Utah before that, right?
Yes. Wow. Yeah, you've done your homework.
Yeah,
trained in Utah for my everything clinical.
Awesome.
Pharmacy school to fellowship.
Great. Debra.
Hi, I'm Debra Moser. I'm from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I'm a nurse and I am a PI. I have all sorts of experience. Actually, I'm at the other end of the range. I've been a researcher for 30 years and have had lots of PI experiences, and hopefully I can share some good outcomes.
Ahmad.
Hi everyone, Ahmad Masri. I'm a cardiologist at Oregon Health and Science University, and I've been on faculty here coming up to my 6th or /7th year.
Excellent. And then last but not least, Palak.
Yeah, sure. Thanks everybody for the invitation. My name is Palak Shah. I'm an advanced heart failure cardiologist. I wear a number of different hats at Inova, but I think for the purposes of this discussion, AHA funded, NIH funded, industry funded, and I'm in my close to 12th year of faculty. So I guess I'm solid mid-career at this point.
Excellent. Excellent. In a very kind of informal setting, I know, when we're online, it's hard to ask questions just because of kind of the awkwardness of it. But certainly if anything comes up during it, from the audience, ask questions or clarifying questions, and we'll have some time for question and answer at the end as well. So maybe we'll start on the basic science end of thing. So Priya, when you're thinking about starting your career and you're looking backwards now in year 5, as you said, what were the most important factors that you think, kind of put you where you are right now? Was it the environment that you're in, the direct mentor that you had, or the field that you were kind of entering?
All great questions. Hard hitting as always. God. I would say all of those things. So I will say that, from a basic science translational setting, when you're thinking about actually having your own lab, there is a lot to be said for being in an environment that is supportive of that mission, because it's in a very expensive mission, and it is not something that you want to undertake in a environment that maybe does not have the infrastructure that's able to support it, or presence that's there supportive of that mission and cognizant of how much it costs. So I will say it is very important to have mentorship in the place that you're going to go to. So for me, when I think back on it, a lot of my first choices for where my first faculty position was going to be was the kind of science I was doing towards the end of my cardiology fellowship. So I had the luxury of being in a T32 program, so I had the opportunity to do a postdoc with Mark Anderson, who was my mentor then and remains my mentor to this day, even though he's moved institutions. So that is, I think, the power and really the importance of having a scientific direction, being cognizant if the environment around you is supportive of that mission and has the infrastructure that's available to facilitate that mission. And then to have not one, but to have multiple mentors, especially if you are a physician scientist, somebody on the pure science side, somebody on the clinical side, and marrying those things, especially early in your career, it's invaluable to have insight from different people who are looking at your career in through a different lens. So looking back, I think the pivotal things that led me to the path that I'm in was the research that I did, the mentorship that I had towards the latter years of my cardiology training, and being in an environment that was supportive of that mission and realistically could move it forward. And having mentorship on sort of both sides, pre-job, post-job.
I love that idea, kind of a group of mentors as opposed to one, really kind of the depth in the bench across your different career and in different parts of your career. I think that's so, important and helpful. And I think I've heard several people say it here, so I'm sure we'll hear more about that. That's wonderful. Ahmad, you've enrolled in HCM and amyloid industry trials really extensively, broadly, lots of trials, lots of patients. How did you set up your research team and frankly your time, and bandwidth and to manage that high enrollment over time and not overwhelm people and make sure you're still having quality, kind of in your data entry and whatnot?
So that's a good question. I think it really largely depends on what is the setup at the system that you are working at, because every place does it differently. The most important, piece of it is that don't believe anyone who tells you you're just there to sign your name or just, be there just to be a physician who's involved peripherally in this. You're responsible for what happens to these patients. You're responsible for the conduct of the trial. The FDA doesn't name your institution, it names you if some problems happen. I've been involved in a lot of these issues, at other places. And, a lot of the times it's part of the setup of the system. The system has the PIs as physicians, frontline physicians, but really has a whole setup with how coordinators and nurses run the whole practice. That's essentially a slippery slope. You have to know that when you're going into this, that you are ultimately responsible. So that's the first message for early career individuals. The second message is, if your system has the setup, then it really becomes a little bit easier, where you need to be able to connect with people who have done this before you at your system and at other system and understand how can I actually get into this, because ultimately, traditionally this is being viewed as something that is not useful, and I would highly argue opposite to that. I work in the rare disease space in cardiology, and we have moved from not having medical treatment for a lot of these conditions we treat, to now essentially people come to us for actually that access to treatments and to clinical trials and whatnot. And a lot of the clinical trials we do are open label. So that's a really important piece. So that's the second point. One is that you're responsible. Two is that it actually has a lot of benefits, to it. The third piece of it is that, especially with the environment and the funding environment currently, I think, this is something that you are protected doing, in a sense that you're not relying on the waves and changes in the funding cycle from the public, space with the NIH and with others. You are being paid, not you personally, but the institution is being paid for the services that you are doing as part of your conduct of the clinical trial. The other piece is that you have to, that you want to commit to it, is that what is the structure at the place you're at? if you end up having a lot of patients and a lot of success in this, is this going to be something that you add on top of everything else you're doing? Or is this going to be something that you lump into your clinic? Are you going to be even allowed to do that? And then are you going to be able to actually execute on the trial in the sense that if a trial requires 10 MRIs or 10 echoes essentially over 10 months, can you actually even do that as part of your health? So you have to investigate all of these things and it can get complicated, but the principles are the same. One, what is the structure internally? Two, how can you essentially ensure that you're going to be successful, with this endeavor? Because you never want to be essentially, over promising and under delivering in the end of the day. And then the third thing, has to do also with how can you start? Let's say that you've never done this before. You don't have enough people around you in your own section who have done this before at your institution. How can you start? And typically the start essentially is one laying the ground on all the things that I've already mentioned, and then finding a supportive individual or a mentor or a friend who can actually advocate for you. And in order to be advocated for, you have to also do your homework in the sense of, I have X number of patients with this condition. I'm pretty sure that I can essentially, work with these patients. And that's how you start. And ultimately, you can get to becoming really truly a clinical trialist with a lot of experience in clinical trials. It's not, only let me put this patient in a trial. Over time, you can build that experience and you can, become very knowledgeable. So it's a multi-step process, but ultimately it is not always, as easy as it's perceived. And at the same time, if it's easy, you have to ensure that you have really oversight over your patients, over the staff that you have at the site you work at.
That makes me want to come work for you after that description of how you run your trials and whatnot. I think that's so amazing. I think that segues really nicely into a question I wanted to ask you, Palak. In thinking, you're funding from multiple sources. How do you frame, funding and kind of your research portfolio across these different funding sources and making sure that all of your, research can move forward appropriately, maybe pulling from one versus the other, both on a personal level as a PI, but maybe also, a little bit from a system hat perspective to make sure all of the people that are underneath you are, making that financial, decisions easy for you and making sure it's kind of equitable across the research types.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. I think there's probably a lot of questions buried in there. So I'll try to cover a lot of it. I think one of the things that I want to just kind of piggyback onto what Ahmad was talking about, right? Research, obviously provides a lot of value for our patients. Academically, we're kind of pushing the needle forward, right? But I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes along with research. And I think sometimes, especially when you're early career, we can kind of take it a bit for granted, right? So I'll give you an example from my own personal career. I started at Inova. Someone's like, oh, why don't you do this really cool heart failure research trial with serelaxin? I was like, sure, why not? Right? We enrolled 2 patients. It was quite a challenge to get even those 2 patients in. And then, about 18 months later, when the trial completed, I got an email from a certain PI who said, hey, Palak Shah, you managed to be the only person who lost 2 patients that you enrolled in the study to follow up out of a study with 3,000 patients in it, right? And so, and I felt terrible, and I didn't know what I was doing. I literally had no idea. And so I think it's really important that it sounds sexy and it sounds cool and we all want to do it, but really understand what you're signing up for. Read that protocol, understand whether you could successfully execute on that protocol. You have the resources, which I heard from Priya as well. You have the institutional resources, whether it's a nurse or a coordinator, et cetera. And I think sometimes you also need to learn hey, how do I say no now to prevent heartache a year from now or 2 years from now as well. And then the last thing I'll say about this, which will get to the question that you actually asked me, is that look, I think some of this also, especially with industry-sponsored studies, is a bit of a business, right? And so Ahmad, you sound like you've built a very successful site-based research portfolio, right? And so I think one of the things you have to start thinking about is well, if I'm a site PI for 4 or 5 clinical studies, we're enrolling well, okay, we enroll well this year, but we don't enroll next year. Do I lose my research nurse? Do I lose my research coordinator? Hey, am I supposed to do this on top of my clinical volume? Or should I start asking for protected time, even though I don't have an NIHK or an AHA grant or something like that, because I am doing so well? And so I think there is a business aspect of site-based research as well, that I would encourage all of us to kind of think about, whether you're early career, mid-career, or you're mentoring other people on how to do this as well. That I think it's important for, for people to understand.
I think that's super helpful. It's fun having the different parts of people in different parts of their career to hear, looking backwards and forwards and whatnot. And maybe this is a good question for Debra and thinking about it. So when you're looking back on your 30 years of experience and you're thinking of grant funding, moving from one grant to the other, did you have a plan, 1 year, 5 year, 10 year about what grant you're going to have and how you're going to fund your time? Or was it more opportunity based? And looking back, would you change any of that strategies that you had?
So it was a combination of strategies. I was, trained by a fabulous nurse, Kathy Dracup, my mentor for life. And I also worked with Lynn and Bill Stevenson at UCLA, and just really had wonderful training about how to think about your career in the future. They were, very helpful in, launching new investigators, even though Lynn and Bill obviously are physicians and I was a nurse. And so I can't actually underestimate or underscore the importance of having a great mentor. But so it was a combination of, I have always been delighted at picking up new opportunities when they came to me. And because of, the mentorship I had, people would, mentors would offer things to me. They would introduce me to people. And so I had really some great opportunities. It does take, though, it's very important to think about what you're committing yourself to and not take advantage of every single great thing that comes to you. You have to, I know everybody has heard this, but you have to learn how to say no. And you need to think about it, strategically, what will really, get me the most experience with regard to doing research, get me the most exposure, get me the most, people to network and work with and collaborate with. So I do take advantage of a lot of opportunities that way, but I've always had a plan to be, because of the mentorship, to be, an independent investigator who led teams, always worked in multidisciplinary teams, and to be funded by investigator generated funding, because, drug trials and device trials don't come to nurses. And in my academic positions, I was always, had the tenure track and the need to have an established research career. And I learned early on the importance of, getting grants, not giving up when you don't get them 25 times, and, continuing on, learning from every experience, getting great feedback, always getting feedback from other people, and having a plan, but also being open to the amazing things you learn in any research project. So you really, you can have a plan, but the end of a project might be very different from how you started in the beginning. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in how you view things, and you can change your perspective. And that's really important now in this environment. If you're going for any sort of federal funding, you have to really understand how to, reframe things, but also advocate for what's important, even though some don't think it is. So I think I'll stop there, unless I've not answered your question.
No, it's great. It's super helpful to hear, the different times and taking advantage, but also being able to say no. One of the things I wanted to ask Nosheen, this leads right into it, is obviously you've published, in many different spaces and have done a lot of work, across the heart failure spectrum. So how, have you taken that advice where some people suggest you should be laser focused on one minute area versus others, are very broad and say, whatever interests you in heart failure? How have you taken to that in your own, kind of personal life, and looking backwards, would you change it? And I think Shashank has a follow-up question for you after this.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. A really important question, something I struggled with actually for a while. So just to say out loud, my primary areas of scholarship sort of early, and I would say still to this day, are sort of genetics and heart failure and cardiomyopathy. I became interested in workforce disparities and representation of women and underrepresented populations in medicine, and then medical education, which came through some of my work with our societies, ACC and HFSA in particular. So saying that out loud, those three things sound very different. And of course, I think caused the same reaction in my mentors to make them really caution me against being, as you said, too spread out and unfocused. And so that was something I struggled with a lot as I was making my fellow to faculty transition. What was I going to give up? What was I going to pursue? And then I sort of reorganized my thoughts, I would say, in sort of three principles that really drive what I do today. I ultimately decided to give none of them up because I decided I was very passionate about all three of them, and that I could prove everybody wrong. Maybe not the smartest approach in life, but that's the one I took at the time to prove to my mentors and sort of everybody else that there actually are ways to pursue things that you're passionate about and things that you're largely maybe paid to do and not paid to do. And sort of all those things can sort of reconcile, come together. I think another thing that I worked on to try to present this case to mentors and potentially sponsors and others was the alignment of these issues. So thinking about, for example, the workforce disparities question, it sort of started as an interest in looking at the representation of women in various clinical practices, but then it really blossomed into how is this related to the enrollment of women in clinical trials, a project that I worked on with one of our colleagues here on the panel. And then that sort of blossomed into the concepts of diversity in clinical trials and representation of patients in heart failure clinical trials and cardiovascular clinical trials. And now that has moved on to sort of further investigations and collaborations. And I saw how what I perceived to be probably different or disparate area of focus, actually, I could sort of make a narrative about how it could be aligned. And then I've sort of moved that same concept into thinking about sex differences in genetic cardiomyopathies and HCM in particular, and really can now build a case why all of these things are aligned. And then similarly, bringing that medical education background in, really emphasizing how all these things are linked. So I would say passion, alignment, and then there is some ebb and flow, I would say, that comes with funding. So when I wasn't funded for my K, which is in particular focused on HCM, I had a little bit more time to really say, I'm just going to pursue what I'm passionate about and the ideas that I have, and then was very deliberate about making sure that I turn those ideas into scholarship, publishable units, other sort of institutionally recognized currency, I would say, whether that's manuscripts or funding or grants or otherwise, to sort of prove that I was building expertise in a space or building a science in a space that was maybe not considered to be a quote unquote hard science area at the time. Building collaborative teams and mentor sponsors and collaborators from outside my institution, so that when hopefully the funding came and I had to shift my focus to something else for a period of time, that projects could continue under the leadership of those collaborators who I had built those relationships with. And so those are the systems I think I've set up for now. I obviously don't have it all figured out, but I now actually receive a lot less pushback from my mentors about keeping all these things juggling in the air because of, I think, the structure that I approached it with.
Yeah, Nosheen, thank you so much for sharing those insights. I always learn so much from you every time you share your wisdom with us. To build on those themes, I think two things that are coming away for attendees in the audience, many of whom are trainees or at least in their early career. One is, first, you create your habits, then your habits create you. All of you are force multipliers in that regard. And if we could steal all your habits and actually execute, it would do worlds for all of us, myself included. And number two, kind of your destiny, one of my mentors kind of told me this once, your destiny lies at the confluence of strategy and serendipity. And it's really the former that attracts the latter. And I think in particularly challenging times that we have from a funding standpoint now, I think that's helpful. One aspect that I was hoping you could embellish on, and then I'll go to our latest faculty guest to join us, Muthu Vaduganathan. Thanks so much for joining us, Muthu. But Nosheen, first, can you talk a little bit about this mentorship matrix that you've built? Everyone says find a good mentor. It's a little bit like finding, your life partner. Like, how do you find, someone that sort of checks off all these boxes? What are you looking for? And then, as many are early career or soon to be early career, how do you become one yourself? And how do you become the mentor you wish you had? And talk to us tangibly about some of those habits. I know you've shared this in other forums. I think it bears duplication in this setting.
Thanks very much, Shashank. I'll try to be quick. So for the first sort of how do I find a mentor? Again, still figuring it out. I think a couple of things I learned early were this concept we've touched on already about the board of directors. I decided very early, and I got good advice that there's not one person that will fit all the roles for you. And I took that advice to heart and really had an honest conversation with myself about what I needed scientifically, personally, et cetera, from a leadership perspective, the different domains in my life, and then made deliberate attempts to find people who could fill those gaps. And of course, as your career progresses and you move on from trainee to faculty, it does take effort to maintain those relationships, which I think is 100% worth investing in. And I'm happy to talk about those other things. I think the more relevant question, at least for me at this moment, and what Shashank and I had discussed previously at a different forum, was something that I struggled with a lot in my early career, and I think a lot of early career folks struggle with, is the transition to becoming a mentor. I'm very open. I've talked about this, about how many mistakes I feel like I made along the way. So as I was talking about earlier, I was very passionate about mentoring others, and especially in the domains of the prior conversations we were having about workforce disparity. So I intentionally really wanted to mentor early career women, trainees in the pipeline, mentor them to become cardiologists, and obviously pursue careers in science if that was their choice. So obviously, focusing on that took away from time on my own scientific development, and that was a real challenge for me. So I would say I gave this example, as Palak shared, sort of some of the aspects of the failures that we have in our early career time, that I think my first and second year on faculty, I was so focused on mentoring, and I was using my own science as a platform to help mentees. But then I got to the end of the academic year, and I had tons of abstracts at these meetings with mentees as first authors, but I had no original first author publications to show for it. And so I really had to have, you get the sense I do this a lot. I had an honest conversation with myself about how I really needed to change the way that I was pursuing this mentorship, passion of mine, but obviously in a way to also help myself and my career succeed. So I won't go into tons of details, but I'm happy to start to share some of my frameworks for any of you that are interested. Again, I just took a very deliberate approach, honest conversations with my mentees about my own needs as a junior faculty member, especially on an NIHK award, which values publications and productivity and these metrics that have to be demonstrated as a marker of success and future eligibility for funding. So I would say things like, I'm happy to not be first author on abstracts anymore. I don't think that's anything that I need at this point in my career, but I do still need first and senior author publications. So we can work together. I will mentor you through this process, and you can have all the abstracts you want at meetings that we get accepted, but publications are still really important for me at this time. Other things that I did in order to mentor, sometimes this mentee crew is in upwards of 15 individuals, which sounds crazy, and it is a little bit crazy, but I created a mentorship matrix, as Shashank sort of talked about, using a sort of vertical training hierarchy. So I have, at this point, highly curated PGY3s who are very attuned to my needs and my desires and how I like things, and I have them teach the juniors, the interns, and the medical students. And so I've put a couple of layers of intentional separation between across the different mentees, not because I'm trying to stay divorced from them, but because I'm trying to create a situation in which they get peer mentorship, but also protect myself a little bit from the ins and outs of sort of daily mentorship and those kinds of things. And those are some of the strategies. I've learned a couple of other things that have worked really well for me, are to actually have mentees submit writing samples to me prior to engaging in a relationship, to attest to their commitment to working with me. They're sort of understand their skills in a very open and honest way, and that way I can curate what I need and how they can help me accomplish what I need to do, and how I can help grow the skills that they need. Similarly, I have a little sample data set that I will give to individuals who say that they have analytic or statistical skills, to just give me answer a few coding questions that they have, and so we can sort of end up on the same platform for what else they need for their training. So those kinds of really discrete examples and really making it objective and making sure that I have these honest conversations with my mentees have really helped me, as Shashank said, multiply the impact that I hope to have on mentees and the future pipeline of cardiology, but also really help me keep up my productivity. That's really important.
I think that's amazing to hear, and it's particularly the details. I think I saw a hand raised, but I think it went down. So if you're interested in asking a question, maybe just put it back up. Maybe a question for Orly with a little bit of a transition. So you've been working hard on this multi-site framework to ease the barriers of doing research within the VA system, which we've heard multiple times kind of mentioned obtusely is a challenge when we're talking about funding in the current environment and whatnot. So maybe a couple of questions are couched in that. The first is, tell us about research at the VA, how to do it, how to be successful with it. I think that's number one. And then number two, really what opportunities are available and the pros and cons in this kind of multi-site framework that you're working on building at the VA, making sure you don't get stuck and can contribute, but also have, your name be productive. And as we heard, academic output is important, particularly when they're entering academics.
Sure. So I think it's important to just start off by acknowledging the fact that something that we touched on earlier, but that we didn't specifically address is the financial aspect, is the money piece. And that is something that we all need to be better at getting to know in granular detail how the finances work. And I've had several early pitfalls with thinking that if I'm enrolling in this trial that I will make money or at least break even. And then lo and behold, the inclusion criteria or the patients are just not there that I thought were. And so some of those experiences, in addition to learning from a couple of sponsors about how difficult it was to get studies started at the VA, helped me start to form a network of VA enrolling sites. And the thought behind it is that we're always stronger in research as a community rather than an N of one investigator. Team science always works better and always wins in the end. And so the framework is really distilling down and simplifying the steps to startup and making them not just accessible, but making them more relevant to every single site upfront when it comes to preparing documents, preparing templates and things like that that make study startup for investigators at multiple sites easier. So one of the things that takes a long time at the VA is regulatory. There's multiple steps, and as a new investigator, that can be really daunting. So by making it as easy as possible with mentoring, especially younger VA investigators or younger career investigators on what needs to happen to get a study started, how do you think about the budget, how do you plan for the budget? We sometimes create a budget that other VAs can use. And I think one of the things that has really helped folks is if they're located in a place that they may not have the strong infrastructure that many of you have alluded to already, that there can be this central mentoring approach, and we can at least teach them what to ask of their institutions and make sure that they have the bare necessities to be successful, even if they are not sure if they do, or they're not sure what it takes to be successful in site-based research. And then with that comes efficiencies. So we leverage some of the things that the VA sites have in common, which is electronic health record systems. So making it easier to find patients for outpatient studies using national queries and creating potential lists of potentially eligible patients that can be shared across sites. having weekly meetings with site PIs who, and we did this with a COVID trial, can run cases by each other. Like, what would you do in this case? What about this particular patient? Especially in younger career individuals that are unsure of how to go about categorizing, say, an SAE or what is or is not an event of interest. So we just create a community of learning that, we all learn from each other. We perform better as a unit. And we just have done this multiple times, just rinse and repeat with different types of studies.
Thanks so much, Orly. I want to go, I see a question in the chat, and feel free to use the chat. I know we've got, about a half hour or a little less remaining, but I do want to go to our final faculty guest here, who probably needs no introduction, but Dr. Muthu Vaduganathan. Muthu, you want to introduce yourself, and then I've got a two-part question for you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shashank, and thank you all. I apologize for the late join. My name is Muthu Vaduganathan. I'm a general cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital and a heart failure clinical trialist. I will say that I've been inspired by many of you here already in these discussions, and I think share many of those perspectives in building my own career. I think my entry into heart failure was a bit circuitous and really is grounded in general cardiology. I think I had very broad interests, much like Nosheen shared, and early. And when entering heart failure, I really felt pretty much like an outsider. I didn't, I don't see patients post-transplant. I don't see patients on mechanical circulatory support. And so I said, can I actually fit into this space? Can I fit into a clinical and research atmosphere that is in an area that perhaps is adjacent to what I'm working on clinically? And so that quickly evolved, and I think the field itself has broadened, and I think the umbrella in heart failure has broadened, and organizations like HFSA have really allowed a number of people to join this team, and so that has eased that transition really nicely. Much of my work is in clinical trials in heart failure, but also ones that sort of border on adjacent areas like obesity, diabetes, chronic kidney disease. And I too work with a very broad team, and I will say that probably more than half of the team that I work with are actually not cardiologists. They are endocrinologists, they are nephrologists, primary care doctors. And so that has allowed me to sort of borrow the best of all these worlds and then bring it back to this central home of heart failure, and apply many of the analytic techniques, the enrollment mechanisms, some of which that Orly has beautifully championed, that have really worked in other disease states, and apply them to heart failure. And so that's been my kind of circuitous road, but now I feel like this is my home, and it's been quite welcoming.
Well, as usual, you already anticipated my first question, but it just bears repeating and perhaps some embellishment, which is, you've stayed at the institution at which you trained, and sometimes that can be a challenge in trying to distinguish yourself from your mentor. And can you talk a little bit about sort of building a narrative arc to your research career, which, early there are certain projects you're given, you execute, but then in your career, really that originality to your ideas and building your own kind of distinct career. How have you navigated that? And then the second part, which I think we'd all love to learn from, certainly myself included, is your approach to writing. It's one of the most prolific and beautifully done in the business. Would love if you could share some of those habits, keystone habits that have been critical to your success.
Thanks, Shashank. The first is really challenging, and I was very fortunate to have a really almost one-to-one relationship with a mentor that we worked very well together, and we sufficiently allowed my growth, but at the same time provided me guidance and mentorship when I needed it. And that was really critical during that transition. But at any point in time, I think we have to make these critical decisions about when to branch out, when to broaden that scope, and when to sort of distinguish ourselves from that mentorship team. And in my case, I sort of quickly realized what doors were being opened through my mentor, through my primary mentorship mechanism, and then which doors I could open separately. And I think that a lot of the interactions I had with, especially other disease states, other fields, was in many ways my way of distinguishing myself. And my primary mentor is a heart failure clinical trialist, and I still believe, I don't think we need to completely branch away from that mentorship, so early. I think even, early mid-career investigators should have strong mentorship teams, and you should still continue to be and ask for sponsorship when the time comes, because sometimes, especially in clinical trials, the reality is that doors, that there is a training pathway to becoming a clinical trialist, but sometimes doors are only open through sort of the network that you participate in and that you work within. And so that's why I for one, have made a conscious effort to actually remain very tied to my mentor and my mentorship team. And broaden the scope mostly through my interactions with adjacent areas. The second is, I love writing. It is a passion of mine. Many people kind of say, why do you enter academic medicine, and what inspires you? And a lot of it is kind of being able to share that with the rest of the world and being able to interact with investigators truly across the globe through writing. And it's a mechanism to be able to share thoughts and work with people, but also create kind of a story and a compelling one that someone might read. And that has always kind of got me pretty excited. And the mechanisms by which I do so, I think, finding protected time during the day is very difficult, but making before we had my daughter, I would sort of carve out a very early period in the morning, between sort of 5 and 7 a.m. or so, before the workday starts and before even email traffic starts. And so the sort of distractions are minimal. And I would actually turn off all electronic kind of communications during that period of time. And I would focus on one writing piece, and it would be a very focused kind of, and it would be almost a sprint. And some institutions have championed this. I know University of Michigan had a really nice sprinting effort in which there is also team-based writing that's similarly where you carve out, instead of a noon conference, you have a 1-hour session in which you put up a Word document on a screen and you all write together. And even if it's 3 people, I think that is actually quite helpful. As trainees, it's quite difficult because you're balancing a lot of clinical work and training, and so often partnering with someone can be quite helpful, and a person that you trust, a person that blends well with your own writing style, and where you can hand off some of the elements of writing, and especially during revision processes where those can get stuck if you're on an ICU rotation or a heart failure rotation. And so that's another mechanism to kind of keep the ball rolling and move things along. But I think ultimately it is the passion for writing and that ultimately translates, I think, to productivity.
Thank you, Muthu. Appreciate you sharing the wisdom, and really all of our faculty. We certainly want to open it up to questions, and we'll get to one in the chat here briefly. But before we do, Palak, I was wondering if you could actually chime in a little bit about this. Most of the folks here are at traditional academic environments. You came from very academic environments to a place before Dr. O'Connor arrived at Inova that was not academic. Talk to us about sort of developing external mentorship and then going through a very traditional path of career development awards, NIH funding, industry funding, and so on and so forth, if you could briefly.
Yeah, sure. I think it's an important kind of concept to just make sure we share with everybody. So I'm going to circle back to one of the topics we talked about earlier about being laser focused and narrow versus being a little bit more broad and diversified. And I think this is important because I think often in the university environment, especially if you have a strong mentorship team, you're looking to pursue grant funding. Those types of environments, at least traditionally, have allowed you to be laser focused, right? And I think that especially when you're early on in your career and you're thinking about, hey, I'm thinking of applying for an AHA award or a career development grant or a K-23, I think you have to demonstrate that you are really focused on this one area so that when they fund this grant for you, then all of a sudden you will become the next world expert on that one specific area. And I don't know, I welcome comments from the panel here, whether they challenge that concept, but I think for that traditional early career development grant, you have to be super focused. And then Shashank, to answer your question, I think, Inova was a very different environment when I came here 11 years ago. And so for me, although in my mind, I had this idea that I was going to be a translational investigator, pardon the kid behind me, a translational investigator, I realized that if I put all of my eggs in one basket, I may not succeed. And so my eggs at Inova were site-based research, which is what Ahmad's doing. I was trying to do genetics, which is what Nosheen's talking about. I was trying to do a molecular lab, which is what Priya was talking about. And although you may have looked at me and said, well, God, it took him 7 years to get a K and things like that, before I got funded, I think that was what I needed to do to be successful in that environment because it was a non-traditional university environment. And I think you can do that and you can succeed outside of the traditional university environment. And I think if you look at our current landscape of funding, right, this is a perfect example is that if I was a solely NIH dependent investigator, I'd be really worried about what I was going to do with my academic career right now. But I think that kind of mindset that we developed said, okay, well, there's NIH funding, there's AHA funding, there's all of these philanthropic organizations, there's industry funding, and that entire portfolio of funding has allowed us to kind of keep growing and succeeding, even though we don't have this huge NIH portfolio of grants. So I think that is important to think about, especially if you're thinking about pursuing a career outside of a big kind of traditional university medical system.
I think a really helpful answer to hear kind of different perspectives as a whole. And if anybody has any questions of our audience, please just raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can ask it or put it in the chat. Maybe just before we get to that, and this is open to the whole group, one of the questions that comes up from an institutional perspective or a section perspective is how do you make sure that your trials aren't overlapping? You're going to have the, correct patients that you're enrolling, et cetera. We've heard this multiple times. And on a basic science perspective, making sure that, what we're pursuing is aligned within the division and section. So what have different institutions done to, allow for those goals? Everyone wants to do well, but maybe talk over those goals or make sure that we don't have overlapping trials. So anybody who wants to jump in, feel free.
You can maybe briefly start. I think there are many experienced investigators here, but one of the strategies that has been quite successful is trying to embed trial site-based enrollment in your own kind of clinical practice. And whether that is a specialty clinic where there is typical referrals of patients that will be enrolled in trials, or if it's partnering, for instance, in an obesity clinic or a diabetes clinic where there might be eligible patients. And if there's a process in place in which, for instance, all new patient referrals go through a screening process, your clinical coordinator might actually review each of those records ahead of time. I think that often helps, and they may be screening for a number of trials, and that actually creates this really nice kind of pipeline in which an individual patient might have the possibility to actually be approached for a couple of different trials, and creates this kind of menu of options for research coordinators as well. And I will say that the financial bit cannot be sort of overemphasized. That Orly shared, I think it is often very challenging to make site-based research financially viable as an investigator with one trial as a primary enroller. And so actually creating this, and if you really want to be an effective site-based investigator, you really do need at least more than one trial underway at a given time, because that actually allows you to use the same research coordinators across many different trials, and so shared resources.
Orly?
So piggybacking on to that, I think a model that has worked well, at least at my institution, and I know at others, is to pool resources. So to have several investigators. So there are several people that are very interested in enrolling in heart failure trials at my institution. And so we have to really sit down and make sure that each study that we agree to do is okay with the group and doesn't interfere or tie up a patient for 5 years that might be eligible for, for a different study that someone else is interested in. So having a team-based approach where you share everything, including coordinators, makes it more financially viable for everybody, because once, sometimes if a study is enrolling well 1 year, but then, as someone else mentioned, not enrolling at all a different year, but someone else's study is enrolling, that it's not as much pressure. And we've especially done this for early career people where we don't have them buy into anything, and then any money that they may produce by enrolling a patient, they get to keep and don't have to pay a coordinator, just to help them build that war chest that they can later use to fund other research.
I want to be sensitive to the time that we have remaining. Parth, if you want to come off mute, feel free to share your question. And then just for our panelists to give fair warning, we'll come to each of you for your kind of closing comments, your parting 1 or 2 sentences, words of wisdom for our group here. Thank you. Parth?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Sinha. Hi, I'm Bharat Raleigh. I'll soon be starting my cardiology fellowship at the University of Vermont, and I have a lot of interest in clinical trials in the long term. So far, what I've done is mostly case reports and retrospective analysis of large databases. And my question for the panel was if they recommend pursuing additional training focused on research beyond the general cardiology fellowship. And if there are any examples of any programs you could suggest, that would be very helpful, which have a focus on becoming a clinical trialist in cardiology after finishing general cardiology fellowship. Thank you.
I mean, I guess I'll jump. Bart, can I ask you, are you talking about being like a site-based investigator, or you're thinking about more so like, hey, how do I start to get involved in clinical trial leadership and organization and design and that type of thing?
Yeah, I would be more interested in both the things, to be honest, but my long-term goal would be to be able to design clinical trials, hopefully multi-center trials, which can lead to FDA approvals of new drugs and devices.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm going to probably call on Muthu and Orly here, but I think having some sort of formalized research training, I think, is going to be critical for you if you are looking to get more involved in the leadership of trials, designing clinical trials, understanding, how to do simple things from sample size calculations, but also understanding how to understand disease prevalence, calculate event rates, like all of those types of things. You just have to have formal training. And so to me, at least, I think some sort of a master's in clinical and translational clinical research and a master's in public health that's focused a little bit more on some of the biostatistics and clinical outcomes research, I think that's quite critical. And you should think about doing that as part of your general fellowship. I'll stop here.
I see Orly added this to the chat as well. I 100% agree. So I actually have, and Bart, thank you for the question. I pursued a master's in public health early, and I felt that the degree was pretty broad and covered areas that were well beyond what you shared just now is pretty laser focused, and you're looking for a particular skill set that I think that a broader degree like an MPH might not actually be needed. And so taking courses that probably are embedded in what Orly is included in the chat, like a master's in clinical investigation, I think is exactly what you need. And some institutions actually even have as a part of their public health schools or have clinical trial courses that you can individually either audit or take rather than as a part of a full degree program. And it is not the degree that you're looking for. It is the coursework and the training that is embedded inside. So even if you don't complete a formalized degree, that shouldn't be the end goal. And then ultimately, some of our societies also have clinical trial courses. And so look out for those announcements. Those are really helpful, not just for the content that's shared, but more so for the exposure. And so you're really wanting to rub elbows with everyone you see in the clinical trial world is pretty small. And so rub elbows with everyone you meet and say, I'm interested, I want to be involved. And then there are fellow networks like Cardio Nerds that I think are quite successful in getting fellows involved, and many really large scale trials, many that I think you would be interested in. That is a bridge to kind of get your foot in the door.
I think it's wonderful advice, and I think at your own institution, seeking out the mentors that are enrolling and doing those trials, and then doing anything you can to be involved, and then how are they thinking about it, going to the research meetings as kind of a smaller way when you're within your fellowship, in addition to the broader training. Maybe a last question, and I think we've kind of under discussed the basic science piece of it, so I apologize. But a question from the chat about speaking about the K to R transition. Obviously, a very large topic that is not a 2-minute thing, but maybe Priya and Nosheen, some thoughts as you're thinking about this type of transition.
Sure. No, I just put some thoughts in the chat. So I think it's a big transition, and it's challenging, and especially given our current funding environment. I think I will also echo some of the sentiments from the rest of the panel that I think variegation in your funding is important. So I will say I am an NIH K awardee before this. I had a T32 fellowship. And so some of the things from making that transition from K to R is being focused enough on what you are funded for to deliver on what you're funded for. So that is in terms of a manuscript that was from your K-funded work or abstracts. And these are the things that I think are important as your currency, as a deliverable, that the investment that they initially made in you has been made good. And they are more likely to give you more money. And along the way, you'll find that these key experiments that you're putting together to put into your first manuscript will go in different directions. And those different directions may attract different types of funding, whether it be from philanthropy or pharma or other collaborations that you see. So for my own lab, I was fortunate that, I have K funding, but along the way came a philanthropic contribution that is doing some translational work. And then there's, some small foundational grants that came from projects that came from my K. But at the end of the day, I think for a large mechanism like an R from a federally funded agency, they want to make sure that you're actually, what did you do with your initial investment? I think that's very important when it comes to them viewing you in a lens that's favorable for future investment.
Beautiful response. And I know we're over time. If I can just trouble our faculty for one more minute, some parting comments, and I'll just take it across my screen on the top. Orly, we'll start with you.
I think something that we maybe had not touched on so much is that it's okay to pivot. I think we can often get really stuck in our idea and in our area. I actually spent many years my early career running my own lab, and then I discovered clinical research, and I pivoted, and I haven't looked back, and physically left the lab. But that was, that took some a lot of thought, a lot of just questioning myself. So when you come across, whether you're in a project or in an area and you're just not having fun anymore, or you're running into a dead end and it's just, and you see something else that might be interesting or a good, direction to pivot in, don't be afraid, because it can be better.
Sage advice indeed. Dr. Moser?
I think that it's really fundamental to work to maintain the passion that you have for research and to remember the incredible outcomes from research, to not only to mentees, but to patients and to the future. And it's sort of, it's easy to put that aside because it does, take a lot of effort. But working with a collaborative team who can bring in new ideas, but sort of, everybody is sort of in a similar vein with regard to some measures, and, theoretical frameworks or theoretical views really can help with that passion. But I think trying to maintain that is essential. Thanks.
Beautiful. Palak?
I'm going to say stay hungry and stay positive. So, I think like Muthu kind of described, right? Research isn't necessarily easy. There's a lot of 5 a.m., 6 a.m. writing papers. It's a lot of weekends and stuff like that, but it's honestly super rewarding. And if you really enjoy it, definitely pursue it. And then I think you have to stay positive. I think especially early on in your career, there's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of like, papers don't get accepted. Grants are almost always guaranteed to get rejected, and you have to resubmit them. And I feel like a lot of times it's a lot of no, 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 no. And then eventually the yeses start coming in. And so, be perseverant and stay positive, because if you really want to do it, I think there's a great path there.
Great advice. Ahmad?
So I would say that, you might learn a lot of things on the job. And so I don't think this is one of the things that you're going to graduate from fellowship thinking that you actually have it figured out. A lot of this is learning on the job. It's okay to take your, early, career years to learn this, to know what you want to do and how to run it. And sometimes your actually next opportunity or job within the same institution or another institution is where you actually have it figured out. And you're going to continue to learn as you go. I don't think you're going to really have everything figured out. There is no course, there's no fellowship for this stuff. Even if you end up doing a fellowship for it, essentially you're gonna learn a lot on the job, and the circumstances around you at the institution you're at will actually determine a lot of what you do, your success or whatnot as well.
It's true. Research is often a choose your own adventure, and all the trials and tribulations that come with that. Muthu?
Yeah, I'll just say your kind of name is everything, and make it a point that people remember your name and get your name out there, participate, be present, and do good work. And ultimately, even if it's seemingly kind of small contributions of case reports, of small series, of institutional experiences, ultimately that does actually grow your brand. And you want to then be remembered in that room when committees are being formed or investigators are being selected for that next research endeavor. And it might take some time, but it will happen. So continue to do work. It's a long road, but being persistent, you'll get there.
Priya, and then Nosheen, you'll have the last word.
I think, you know, your own small business as a PI. So do the thing that you love, because it is a lot of it's a lot of your own legwork to build collaborations and to partner with people. And it is a really, really fun journey. So, you know, that is what's going to keep you going. And you do really important work. You change and challenge the way we think about the world and health and science. And it is really important when you have your 100th rejection for your paper and your 100th grant proposal that got turned down, that you truly believe that inside you, that you are doing impactful things, whatever field you're doing it, whether it's clinical or basic or translational. So, you know, and do it as a team, because you do have friends, you do have people in this community who are supportive of that. And science is best done when it's done together. So reach out. And you know, sort of keep the faith. I think that's probably what I can say, and especially in these times.
Nosheen.
Thank you, Shashank. I've had to cycle through about 10 closing thoughts to come up with something original after the end of this incredible panel. I've learned so much. I would say invest in yourself. There's no time. It can be too late, but it's never too early. And we've talked broadly here about various skills related to clinical trials and basic science research. But I would say even things for the folks who are early in their career, like just reading a lot. Read everything you can read. If you don't feel like you're a good writer, work on your writing skills, and it's possible you can get better. Watch people give talks. Learn how to make slides. If you see somebody's talks you really enjoy, try to emulate them. And then talk to the people that you admire. Cardiologists love talking about themselves. Maybe this is a phenomenon that spans all of medicine, but cardiologists especially love talking about themselves. So if you want to meet someone or hear about their journey, just send an email. You know, what's the worst that could happen? You don't get a response, but often you will, and you'll learn a lot from it.
I feel a little bit selfish here. This was my original question, and this is everything I would have wanted to hear, you know, when I first asked this to Shashank a year ago. So thank you guys so much for joining. Obviously, we could have a conversation one-on-one that would have been brilliant with all of you, you know, for 60 minutes. And so we squished a lot in, but hopefully helpful. And we encourage everyone at HFSA to come to the Pit Lounge, the early career and the trainees, to hopefully have more conversations like this. And really just, again, thanks to everyone on the panel. I learned so much and always inspiring. Shashank, any last words?
No, thanks very much to the faculty. I mean, what you're seeing here, they're generously giving up their time away from their families to spend it with you and graciously imparting their words of wisdom. And so you can see that this community really cares a lot and cares a lot about you. And so feel free to reach out to any of them, ourselves included, and then give us candid feedback. We're in the process of planning ASM 2025. I know Nosheen was in that role last year, and you know, we really want to make these Pit Lounge sessions meaningful for you. And so we want to build on this theme. All these webinars that we've been having that the Early Career Committee has been sponsoring, it's really designed for you and by you. So thank you very much. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And thanks very much again to our faculty, as well as the audience. Really appreciate all of you.